So, as some of you know, we've been doing some work on drama. Because one of the critical aspects of changing a population is the ability to communicate ideas. And what you're doing when you're performing in a play, or reciting a poem, or singing, is you're communicating an idea. And presumably, if you do it with the classical repertoire, you have an idea which, in the hands of one of the great thinkers, someone like a Mozart. Today, Ed was doing some work on the Mozart Requiem, just getting prepared to do some accompaniment. If you take a piece of music like Mozart's Requiem, you can't just, if you're a singer, you can't just get up there and say, well, hum a few bars and I'll catch on. Because it's one of the most profound works in all of history. A work on this question of what does it mean to be a human being, to live a life, to leave a mark. And in the hands of Mozart, who at that time was a highly mature musician, how he chose to present the words of a classic requiem. Because the requiem, the language, you don't play around with the language, but you demonstrate your grasp of the idea by the way you compose it. And so, to perform a piece such as the requiem, you actually have to be able to think through what was in the mind of the composer when he was confronting the question of his own mortality. And so similarly, if you're working on a play by Friedrich Schiller, who was himself a beautiful person, and by that I don't mean he looked good. I mean he spent his whole life developing his higher qualities, his qualities of reason, his ability to take what he knew about changing himself and provide the tools to other people so they could figure out how to improve themselves to be a better citizen. Similarly with Shakespeare. Now, a lot of people have this crazy view of Shakespeare, which is that, he was allegedly one guy who wrote a lot of plays. Some people, like our friend, not our friend, but our enemy, William Yandell Elliott, still argues it was Francis Bacon, a guy who could barely write, who was the author of Shakespeare's plays. But most people have this funny idea of Shakespeare, and these days you don't even read him very much. And just out of curiosity, how many of you in high school read a Shakespeare play? Right, virtually everyone. How many of you read more than one? How many of you read more than three? How many of you have attended a live performance of a Shakespeare play? A number of you.
You mean in high school?
Well, in your whole life. How many of you, after you got out of high school, on your own, just picked up a Shakespeare play and said, I'd like to read this? All right, it's people who mostly are in the organization. Now, we launched a project a while back to perform Schiller and Shakespeare. And I invited someone who is a Shakespearean actor, who's acted in Shakespeare, who's directed Shakespeare, who thinks a lot about the issues raised by Shakespeare. I invited him to come in and work with us. And we had, a few months ago, we did a roundtable on Hamlet. But before that, we did a conference presentation, which he helped me with. And then he's been working on the drama. For those who don't know him, it's Robert Beltran, who's in the back of the room, who I've called on to help me over the next couple of presentations when we're going to take a look at another play by Shakespeare, a play that some of you probably know called Othello. Now, how many people have read the play Othello? Now, just one of you who's read it, what do you think the play is about? And I don't want a wise guy who's heard me talk about it already tell what I've said about it, but someone who hasn't heard what I have to say about Othello, what do you think the play Othello is about? Anyone who's read it?
Spousal abuse.
What?
Spousal abuse.
Spousal abuse, okay. Actually, on Lifetime Channel, they could probably do it that way. Typical male oppresses his wife. Yeah, okay. Well, what I'm going to do is take tonight and part of Saturday to give you a sense of the background of the play Othello, so that when we get into the play, you see something more to it than the question of spousal abuse. Because the play was written in a specific context, in a moment when England was under attack. The nature of England, would it be a republic? Would England be a monarchical republic? Would it be an empire? This was the issue when Shakespeare was writing. What would be the future of England? And you can't understand his works without understanding that on top of everything else that he was, Shakespeare was a patriot who had a profound commitment to the idea of the Tudor, and by that I mean the Tudor family monarchy, which was brought in by one of the few really good kings of England, Henry VII. And Shakespeare knew that the Tudor dynasty was threatened. In fact, while he was still alive, the Tudors died out. Queen Elizabeth was the last Tudor monarch.
What time period is it? Time period?
1603 for Elizabeth is when she died. Henry VII was 1485. He became the king. So there was a period of time in which England was moving ahead, 1485 to about 1511, 1508. Then a period of time for over 100 years in which there was an intense battle in England, which then continued through most of the 17th century, right up to the end of the 17th century, over what would be the nature of England. And Shakespeare, being a part of a political grouping, by that I don't mean he was a card-carrying party member or something, but he was part of a grouping of intellectuals who, in the tradition, the Republican tradition, going back to the Republican tradition in Greece of Socrates and Plato, and the theatrical or the dramatic tradition, the classical tradition of drama, of Aeschylus and Sophocles, Shakespeare took upon himself the responsibility to present ideas to his audience that could help them become better people and hopefully better governors of their island. And so to understand what Shakespeare was involved in, I'm going to be introducing, and for some of you who were here a week and a half ago, I gave an initial introduction. There's a whole lot that can be said about this topic, but we're going to take a look at the real issue that's behind the play Othello. And when I say behind the play, it's there everywhere in the play. But if you're a modern English professor teaching this in a class called The Shakespearean World and Our Day, or something like that, you'd miss it. Now, who knows where Othello is set? John? Yes. Othello is set in Venice. Do you think Shakespeare just wanted to do that? He just thought it would be cool to put it in Venice, or do you think there was a reason? Well, what we're going to look at is why Venice. Imperial Venice, sometimes mistakenly called Republican Venice. And what I want to give you a sense of is something that's clear to Shakespeare called Venetian method. That is, the method by which the Venetians sought to subvert the idea of a republic. And why was this so important? Because in Shakespeare's day, the Venetians directly, with Venetian agents, were in England, trying to sabotage and destroy what potential remained of England to become a republic, and transform England into the new Venetian Empire. And unfortunately, they were ultimately successful. And some of the questions Nick was posing today, don't drop out of your mind for a moment this question of the oligarchy that he talked about in his briefing, the idea of the utopians, because what you're going to see is that the methods applied by the Venetians from 1177 up to the time of Shakespeare at the end of the 1500s, early 1600s, the methods were exactly the same. And the same methods of the Venetians today live on through such people as the self-proclaimed Vulcans, which is the name that Condoleezza Rice gave to the crew of people who today want a war against Iraq. For what purpose? To transform the United States into a global empire. So we'll start with this question of republic, the battle for a republic. Now, some of you have been attending the Sunday night sessions where we are involved in reading Plato. Those of you who haven't been doing that, I would urge you to start coming. What time is it? 6, 7? 7. 7:30? All right, 7. Because right now we're reading the Republic, right? We're better to get an idea of what a republic is than Plato's Republic, since this was the first fully articulated discussion of what a republic is. And when I say a discussion of what a republic is, Plato doesn't say, what is a republic? A, this, B, that, C, that. And this will be on your test. But what Plato does is take you through a long, extended discussion of the most profound questions about how a nation should be run, what a human being is, how human beings interact and engage in a process of self-government. Because ultimately the key concept of a republic is the concept of institutions of self-government. Now, the battle for a republic from the beginning, the two most important people, on one hand you have Plato, whose protagonist was his teacher, Socrates, the great dialoguer, the person who was the corrupter of youth. And why was Socrates a corrupter of youth? Because he insisted that you never say you know something unless you really know it. Socrates would be hated today because, people, you have a pollster and they go out and they say, what is your opinion on Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction? They ask a person who could not possibly have an opinion that would mean anything, unless it's Scott Ritter. Now, there's a guy who has an opinion on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which has some weight since he was there for 5 or 6 years investigating them, which is why the LA Times and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal accuse him of being a fraud, because he actually knows something about the topic. But most people have opinions on things, and Socrates would say, okay, that's your opinion, but what do you know about it? And this question of a republic and actually knowing how to discover truth and how to use the discovery of those truths to organize a society, including an economy, is the central issue of a republic. Now, Plato had a very important adversary who, to this day, again, if you go to Santa Monica City College and take Philosophy 101, they'll probably lie about Plato's leading adversary. They'll probably tell you he was a student of Plato who continued the work of Plato. That would be the equivalent of saying what? Well, I can't even think of something.
Adolf Hitler continued the work of Abraham Lincoln.
No, Adolf Hitler continued the work of Moses Mendelssohn. Yeah. Aristotle dedicated his life to destroying the influence of Plato. And the way he destroyed it is he said, well, I come from the Platonic Academy, which Lynn, in an answer to Anna, said was a lie. That Aristotle was around those circles, but he never really attended. If he would have, Socrates or Plato would have kicked him out. He would have failed Philosophy 101 in Athens. But Aristotle set up a whole alternative system. And what we're going to look at is how this fight was the central fight that determines what you're doing right now. That those of you who are here who are not full-time members once you understand this fight, it will help you see why we're telling you you have to join the LaRouche campaign. And more than that, it will also help you get a better handle on what it means to live a good life and to get beyond this question of I'm just going to make it, I'm just going to get by, actually to go to the most fundamental question, which is what is the purpose of human life? And so in order to actually understand a play like Othello, you have to understand this battle. Now, I'm not going to go through Plato said this, Aristotle said that, but you'll get over the course of this discussion, provided you pay attention and you're thinking, you'll get a very good understanding through the various exponents of the two views. Let me just tip you off. Shakespeare came out of the Platonic conception. Now, what we're going to look at in particular is the relationship of the church, that is the Catholic Church in Rome, and the temporal authorities, that is the rulers of kingdoms, principalities, city-states, and others. And in looking at this, we're going to see how Venice became a power and how Venice became the power committed to destroying the conception of a republic. And here's the first lesson you need to know. What was Venice called politically? The Republic of Venice. So one of the ways you can destroy something is take its name and be the opposite of the conception. And the Aristotelian says, oh, well, Venice must be a republic because it's called the Republic of Venice, when it's the absolute antithesis of a republic. And the typical student of History 101 or Philosophy 101 would fall for that and take a class and they'd say, what was Venice? And you'd say, republic. Or they'd have its question, Venice is A republic, B, a city in California, C, a sex toy. And the person would probably put the city in California, which would be correct because it was never a republic. So you have to realize that the manipulation of ideas, the manipulation of people, can be done very easily just by the name that's put on something. By the way, Aristotle's philosophy, part of his philosophy was known as nominalism, his philosophic method. And nominalism is essentially the practice of giving names to something. Since you can't know the essence of anything, because Aristotle said most of the world is unknowable. All we can know is that something exists and it exists in relationship to something else. So what can we really know? Can we know its essence? No. Can we know how it was created? Can we know where it's going? Not really. But we can name it. And once we name it, at least whenever we see it, we can say, oh, there goes whatever it is we've named. Do you know what it is? Oh, yes, it's a whatever its name is. And that's part of the way also, that you destroy cognition. And you just learn the names of one thing after another. Now, I struggled thinking through this thing, what's the best way to get this conception across? Because I could go through thousands of years of history, I could go through a few hundred years of history, I could take one or two case studies. I decided to first just give an overview to give you a sense of how Venice became Venice. And then to give you a sense of the fights of that time through one of the great Platonic thinkers of that time, a man named Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli is another example of what's done by historians who hate this Platonic tradition. They tell you Machiavelli was Machiavellian. What does Machiavellian mean? Clever, manipulative. Right? If you hear the word Machiavelli, if you know anything about history, this is what they tell you. Someone who's a cheater, they'll say, oh, that was a Machiavellian move he pulled. But actually, you'll find Machiavelli was a dedicated fighter for a republic. He was associated with the Republic of Florence. He was a person who despised the Republic of Venice because he knew it wasn't a republic. And so through his eyes, we can narrow down or get at this concept a little bit more. Now, I also debated whether we should go through a long discussion of the Crusades, because actually that's where this battle started. The first crusade was in 1096. Pope Urban II. He couldn't quite figure out how to conquer all of Europe and Christianize it. He had trouble controlling the local nobility, and so he said, let's go have a regime change in Jerusalem. And that was the first crusade. It's true, that's what it was. The initial regime change. Now, the issue of the Crusades, the thing I want you to know about this, is it brings up the question of this period, which is, are states subordinate to the church, or is the church subordinate to the states? Now, the popes and most of the people in the Curia, in the Vatican, argued that the states are subordinate to the church. And so this was an important battle. It was especially important because the church was generally corrupt. Through most of its history, there have been some popes who were courageous fighters, especially during the period of the Roman Empire. But there have been, the vast majority of popes have been corrupt. They may have been very pious, but they were serving the interests of certain families. They made deals, and you'll get directly from Machiavelli some of the history of this. But we start with an interesting battle in 1177. Now, what happened in 1177 is there was a pope named Alexander III. And he was having a lot of trouble with a man named Frederick Barbarossa, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And the problem the Pope was having is that Frederick was saying that he was not going to subordinate his policies to the church because he thought the church was taking too much money. The church was harming the interests of the people of his realm. And so he actually threatened the Pope, at which point Pope Alexander III decided he needed a protector. And he ran to the lagoon known as Venice. Now, he appealed to the Venetians, you must save me to honor Christianity. And so the Venetians saw this as a chance to control the Pope. They didn't say, yes, it's our Christian duty. They said, it'd be pretty good if we had the Pope under our thumb. So they agreed, and they sent out a fleet. Now Venice, as you'll see in a few moments, is a lagoon in the armpit of Italy, the area where Italy separates from Yugoslavia and then Greece in the Adriatic. They had a fleet because they were a trading power, although at that time they weren't that great a trading power. But they had a fight against the fleet of the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, commanded by his son Otto. And the Venetians won. And they captured Otto and took him in. And the Pope, out of gratitude, named Venice the husband of the sea. Now this may sound like a story from Homer, the god of the sea marrying a city. But I'm going to show you they took this seriously. If we could have someone on the lights out there just so people can see this better. He was from the German states and Sicily. Let's see.
Is that Otto the Wise?
No, I'm not clear on all of the titles, and I don't think this Otto ever became king or emperor. But here you see the Pope giving the ring to the Doge. The Doge is basically Duke, the supreme commander of the council ruling Venice. This is Otto on his knees, having been defeated. And this is the ring that symbolized the marriage of Venice with the sea. The Venetians took this as the authority from the church to control the seas. And it was this moment which really represents the beginning of the Venetian expansion beyond the city-state built on a lagoon to become an empire. Now, a later follower of the Frederick of Barbarossa was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, who was a very important figure because he was an emperor who Christianized Prussia and yet himself preferred the Arabic language, was good friends with leading Muslim thinkers. When he launched a crusade, it was actually to bring together an alliance between Christianity and Islam. And needless to say, he was repeatedly excommunicated from the church. Now, Frederick II's defeat, which was led by the old nobility of Venice and Milan, his defeat led to a dark age. Because after he was defeated, all the internal alliances that existed in Europe broke down. And instead you had little kings and principalities and dukedoms. You had a collapse in the standard of living, a collapse in trade, the breakdown of the Vatican. You had the Pope at one point was kidnapped and taken to Avignon. And if any of you have ever had the wine Chateau Neuf de Pape, that basically means from the new house of the Pope. It's a French wine from Avignon. There was the Great Schism during this period. There was the 100 Years' War between England and France. There was the War of the Roses within England. But the period from about 1240 until about 1430 was nearly 200 years of a dark age. Now, this was, not so shockingly, the period of the expansion of Venice's power. We see in this map the expansion of Venice's bases in the Adriatic. Here's Venice up here. This is the Adriatic. These were all ports that were major Venetian bases. That is, these were places that had alliances with Venice and allowed Venice to use their ports. And as you can see, it extended into the Black Sea and throughout the Mediterranean. This was in the 13th century. About 100 years later, these bases had expanded further. So they used the bases for land routes through Persia onto India. This was actually this part here, as you can see, through Bokhara, Samarkand, Tashkent. This is the old Silk Road, the road that Marco Polo, who was a Venetian agent, took. The road through which Marco Polo came back with Chinese noodles and they became known as spaghetti. Venice was the key power to opening this up, these spice routes to Europe. Yeah.
So Marco Polo was working for the Venetian, right?
Yeah. As were his two brothers.
What time is it?
But not Ralph Lauren. Yeah. Well, they didn't control it, but they made deals. First of all, they told the rest of the Christian world, we're wedded to the sea, so you have to give us the first right. And they used that also with Constantinople, which was the Byzantine Empire. They took control as much as they could of the second head of Christianity. And periodically, they would lead, the Venetians would convince popes to carry out raids on Constantinople as crusades. One of the crusades was against Constantinople. So the Venetians were running all kinds of operations. They made trade deals with the Persians, with the Baghdad Caliphate, and so on. But the Venetians were trading everywhere. And this continued to expand further into the 15th century, when you see that the Venetians by then had added all of these areas here, all of North Africa. The whole Mediterranean was a Venetian lake. Anyone that wanted to do anything in the Mediterranean had to make a deal with Venice. Now, part of what the Venetians did was they ran something that's kind of a typical mafia operation: insurance and maritime insurance. Now, insurance of shipping in those days, that was a pretty tricky business. If you picked up a ton of pepper or some kind of spice or silk in India and moved it through the Indian Ocean and tried to move it up eventually through the Mediterranean to Venice, you could have storms. These were not great ships. You had problems with pirates. The Venetians had deals with pirates all over the world to capture their rivals' goods. And the Venetians then would, when there was something uninsured, that is. But if you insured your goods through Venice, that is, you paid Venice a portion of the proceeds you get, chances were better that pirates wouldn't hit you. And so these were the kinds of things they did. They used typical, as I said, mafia-style operations. Now, as this Venetian operation spread, the Venetians became very instrumental in controlling the church, because their view was that if you could have a static world, that is, the idea of a world that doesn't change, and that has to have ordering principles on earth that reflect the ordering principles in heaven. And the Venetians, being Aristotelians, said that the world was created at one time, God lost interest in it and left, and that's the way the world is. That change shouldn't occur, that's permanent fixed laws. And that, in fact, you need a hierarchical ordering of regimes to impose that order, to keep things under control. And the best way to do it is what way? To convince people that if they go against it, they're going against God. You might just be disagreeing with Venice, but the Venetians made their state a kind of God. And they said that if you defy our state, you're violating the natural order. And they basically tried to convince the church to control the popes to say, yes, it's the Venetian order, the Venetian Republic, that's the model. Now, in the process of this, the popes became increasingly corrupt. The church became corrupt. And out of this, in the early 1400s, because I told you before that the Dark Age started after Frederick II Hohenstaufen. In the 1300s, there was a black plague that nearly wiped out a third of the population of Europe. Bubonic plague, because the populations were weak, hungry, there wasn't enough goods, there was no sanitation. And so you had literally hundreds of thousands of people who died from this plague. And this kind of collapse continued up through the early 1400s. And the church said, that's because you're sinners. You're starving because you're sinners. You have to repent. And you had the flagellants who walked down the streets whipping themselves on festival days. It was quite a bizarre scene. Now, it was out of this that a genuine reform movement developed in the church. And that was around, let me put the lights on for a couple of minutes again. It was around a man named Nicholas of Cusa, a German, who was a Platonic thinker. And Cusa launched a fight to reform the church, to change the church, to reflect the principles of Plato, the idea of the perfectibility of man, the idea that there's always going to be change, but your institutions have to reflect those changes, that you can't have one established order forever, and that everything is just fitting into that order, but you have an order that's changing. And so Cusa said this should be reflected in the church. And in 1437 to 1439, there was a drive to set up an actual council to change the church. And the Pope at that time was Pius II. Now just keep that name in mind, because we're going to come back to Pius in a little while. But Pius II.
Is that also Pius?
Yeah.
The third.
No.
That's not Pius.
Yeah, Pius. No. With Alexander the Third.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Pius II worked with Cusa to set up this reform movement. Now, the key to the reform movement was the idea that the best principles of Christianity must be reflected in the states. That the issue is not who's on top, but that religion should serve as a guide for rulers. And the best rulers are those who act in the interests of being the Christian prince, of bringing their populations the best possible government, to have the best possible laws, to allow for the best possible prosperity and development. This was what came out of the Council of Florence. I'm just giving you a real shortcut on this. I would encourage people to read Cusa, especially the Concordancia Cattolica. We have quite a bit of his writings that have been translated. And by the way, these translations are somewhat unique because it's very, very difficult to find Cusa's works translated. Now, it was out of this movement of Cusa, 1437 to 39, the Council of Florence, that there was a very significant development. The first modern nation state. And that was France, under Louis XI. Now, that was in 1461. The key to Louis was that he was the first one who understood that if you apply the actual principles of Christianity to government, then that means that the best thing in government should be to provide every citizen with the best possible education. Provide every citizen with an opportunity to live securely, not as a serf or a human cattle, but to be lifted up in the sense that they see in themselves the potential for divine perfection. Now, you've got to remember, this is at a time when all of Europe was still quite backward, quite bestial, where you had literally roving gangs that would pillage, and people would sell their freedom to a local nobleman who would hire one gang to protect his neighborhood from a neighboring gang that would come to pillage. That people lived in terrible houses. They had sheep and goats living in the bedrooms with them, if they had bedrooms. And it was in this period that the idea of Christianity as not merely something to give you a goal after you die, but to bring the principles of heaven down to earth, which is what St. Augustine had talked about in the 5th century. This was the reform movement of Cusa, to use these Christian principles to run a nation. And Louis XI was the first one to do this. The second king to do that, as I said, in 1461, and Louis died in 1481. The second country to try this was England. And that was under Henry VII in 1485. And Henry came to power through a war against Richard III. One of the great Shakespeare plays is the play Richard III. Now, imagine what was happening all of a sudden. You had a world that previously was dominated by these empires who owed their power to the church, or the church owed its power to some of these emperors. And most of the population had very little miserable lives. And all of a sudden you had kings who said, the wealth of our nation depends on the improvement of every citizen. That's the Platonic concept of a republic. And so as the Renaissance, which of course you know, this is the period around Cusa in particular that launched the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? It was the rebirth of the ideas of classical Greek, especially Plato. And you had two different movements. One was the so-called Renaissance humanist movement, which was explicitly around Plato. But you had the continuation of the medieval scholastic movement, as it was called, which was based on Aristotle. And the scholastics were the ones who dominated Venice. The Venetians set up the school of Aristotle all over Italy, wherever they could go, especially Padua, and then in Venice itself. Yeah?
What does the word scholastic mean?
Basically means Aristotelian. I mean, a scholastic was someone who would master Aristotle's arguments and do nothing but repeat them. Sort of like, the fellow we had at the Cadre School who was praising his UCLA professor of philosophy because he's memorized the works of Kant. What good is it to memorize the works of Kant unless you want to do some kind of self-torture? And so the scholastics were, in a sense, the other thing about the scholastics is they believed in the anti-Platonic school of the rhetoricians, which is that you should know all sides of every argument and be able to equally passionately argue all sides, because there is no ultimate truth. You can't discover the truth. But the Platonic faction said, you must discover truth. The whole purpose of education is to find out why things exist the way they do, so that you can use that to improve your society. The Aristotelians said you'll never know the truth. All you can hope for is a good ruler. And so you had this fight again, Plato versus Aristotle. Now here's the fascinating thing. As a result of the work of Louis XI and then Henry VII, you had a sudden, and of course coming off Cusa and the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci is another key character in this. Sandy, want to get the lights again? All of a sudden you had an explosion of Platonic thinkers. Erasmus of Rotterdam, one of the most important. Erasmus, if you read him, you find a couple things about him. First of all, he was hilarious. He loved to ridicule Aristotelians. And the thing he liked especially about it is Aristotelians have no sense of humor. It's sort of like the people who are hired to write, or the people who write for college newspapers. They have no sense of humor. You just have to read their attacks on us to realize that they have no idea. I mean, humor is not the only thing they don't understand, but the characteristic of an Aristotelian is that they can't laugh at their own foolishness. So one of Erasmus's great works is called the Praise of Folly, in which he starts out by talking about what a foolish man he is. Let me show you how. And it's a brilliant dialogue, which was dedicated to one of the other great Platonists who I'll introduce you to in a moment, Sir Thomas More. Now, Erasmus is, as a follower of Cusa and Plato, decided it was necessary once and for all to transform the church, because the church was corrupt. The church, after Cusa, after Pius, the church got taken over again by the Venetian network and was working against the Renaissance. And I'll get back to that in a few moments. So you had Erasmus in Rotterdam, who was coordinating a continent-wide network of Platonic schools where they studied Plato the way we do. They get together and read the works of Plato and debate them and argue and use that to then advance the sciences. This occurred in England as well under the initial sponsorship of John Colet, who also worked with Thomas Grocyn. And they set up a Platonic school. And one of the great students that they had, who became a very good friend of Erasmus, was Sir Thomas More, one of the most important figures in English history. Thomas More, who I'll get back to in a moment. And there was also a network of these characters, Erasmians, in Spain. Cardinal Jimenez. When we talk about the evangelization of the New World, you essentially had two groups that came over here from Spain. One were the Aristotelian oligarchy, who believed in slavery, as Aristotle did, and who wanted to set up large landownings and just pillage and plunder. The other were the Erasmians, who came in and said, we're going to evangelize the Indians. We're going to bring them the best of our knowledge. the best of our music from Europe and learn from them. Cardinal Jimenez was one of the leaders of this group. The other major character in this was Juan de Vives. So you had this network of Erasmian Platonists. What were they trying to do? They wanted to destroy the power of the European oligarchy. And that meant that they had to destroy Venice, because Venice was the center of this oligarchy. And Venice was, through its control, and Venice, if you go out and look this up, go to a good bookstore or a good library, and you'll find volumes of letters from the ambassador from Venice to the court of England, to the court of France, because they were spies. The Venetians developed the modern spy system. And they didn't just report on what was going on, they intervened to change how people think. This was the way the Venetians ran their operations. And so this Erasmian current said we've got to develop England, France, and Spain as bulwarks of nationalism, as nation states that can defeat the oligarchical control in Rome and in Venice. And so in 1508, Sam, you can put the lights on again for a moment. In 1508, they came together, England, Spain, France, Genoa, and the Vatican, to form something called the League of Cambrai, or Cambrai. This was a political, military movement with one goal: destroy Venice. And from 1508 to 1510, they moved toward Venice. They defeated some of the Venetian-controlled city-states on the way. The problem was that at this period of time, you had a breakdown of the political leadership behind it. Henry VII died and was replaced by his second son, Henry VIII, who's best known for having so many wives. The Ferdinand Isabella of Spain, who had problems, largely due to the church, Isabella died, and Ferdinand was not all that sharp. And in France, you had a breakdown of the political leadership. So by 1510, the Venetians saw their chance. So they went and they bribed the Pope, Julius II. And they convinced the Pope that he had to switch sides. And when he pulled out of the League of Cambrai, that ensured the victory of Venice, because the League collapsed and the Venetians became the most powerful force. Now, there's a famous painting to give you a sense of the self-conception of the Venetians. Let's take a second here. This is a painting of Venice. Now here's the imperial lion of Venice. And the rest of Europe is coming down, this is the Venetian self-conception, to destroy, to slay the lion, to destroy Venice. Now, the painter of this one is Palma Giovanni. It's not a remarkable painting except for the concept. And of course, the angels want to put the crown on the Doge. This is the Doge, who you'll see in this other painting, Leonardo Loredan. That's the leader of Venice. And the angels were putting the crown on him, and he was defending the lion. Now, Venice at this point was a place of evil. And there's a lot that I can say to you about it, but go investigate it yourself. Read James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Bravo. Read Schiller's story, The Ghost Seer. And you'll see that Cooper, a courageous American patriot, who was an American spy in Europe, as well as Schiller, who was a brilliant poet of freedom who was trying to bring the American Revolution to Europe, they understood what was wrong with Venice. These characters, these doges, who masqueraded as the individuals running the state, but who saw themselves as gods almost, were out to destroy this continental system. And what they did was they tried to pit England against Spain, England against France, and France against Spain. And they succeeded in destroying this Platonic network. Now, let me just give you a little bit on the self-conception of the Venetians. This is a very famous painting by one of the most important painters of the Venetian Renaissance school, Giorgione. It's called The Three Philosophers. And it's an interesting painting because it gives you the Venetian self-interest, or self-conception rather. Here's the young man, the philosopher, contemplating nature. He's got some tools of a scientist there, and he's actually totally engrossed in it. Okay, that's in youth, it's okay to pursue things. But the middle-aged philosopher is a merchant. He's dressed as a rich man, almost could be a doge. And so the young philosopher, the young science student, becomes the worldly merchant. And that's when he's powerful. Of course, when he gets older, he becomes Aristotle. This figure was modeled on a Venetian painting of Aristotle. And so this gives you a sense of Venice's view. The Platonic view is that as you get older and wiser, you move further and further from wealth and riches. In fact, you never pursue wealth and riches. But in the Venetian view, the real power, the one who towers over it, is the merchant in the middle. Now, the essential thing you need to know is that the Venetians went out to destroy the concept of the nation state and promote the idea of the empire. And the key operative they brought in on this was Philip II of Spain, the evil figure in Schiller's play Don Carlos. Now, Philip was the emperor. This is a picture from 1549. He came in, I think, in 1530-something, maybe 1540. And I'm not going to say anything more about Philip because I want to just take you now through Machiavelli's understanding as a Platonist of what he was fighting against. So, do you want to put the lights on once again, Sam? Now, I'm going to give you some of the, just a thumbnail sketch of Machiavelli as a Platonist, his view. First of all, Machiavelli is often accused of being cunning, sly. He had no real belief except power. They portray him as the power-hungry schemer. But in fact, he was a dedicated Republican, committed to the concept of a constitution. On his idea of a republic, he said it's not the Venetian republic. A republic could be guided by a reformed church, but not by a corrupted church. If a church had an interest in temporal power, that is, control over a kingdom or interest in money, that church could not have any influence on a republic. Now, Machiavelli said only a sound constitution can solve the problem posed by man's mortality. Again, this is a Platonic concept. What happens if you have a good ruler and he dies? If you don't have a constitution, his son could be an idiot. His son could be a corrupt, manipulable character. But if you have a constitution, the good institutions of a constitution can survive the men who made them. If you don't believe that, look at the United States. We've had 5 or 6 good presidents, a number of mediocre people, and actually a large number of complete imbecilic scoundrels, with the 2 Bushes on the top of that. Now, the nation still exists with the potential to do good, not because of any of these bad presidents, but we're a nation of laws, not men, of institutions embedded in a constitutional principle. And what Machiavelli said is a constitutional polity, that is a population, serves, or political system, serves to restrain those special interests in a state which, if allowed to act unchecked, would destroy it. So the institutions of the state must protect the state. Now, if this sounds like the U.S. Constitution, it's not surprising. He said, therefore, a constitution is the best guardian of freedom. But leadership is essential to a republic, which must have a strong executive authority and prompt action to meet any crisis. Strong executive, sound familiar again? U.S. Constitution. But at the same time, it has to be restrained by constitutional means from a strong executive subverting the republic. Now, Machiavelli opposed the idea of empire. He said the idea of universal empire implies a certain notion of permanence, which was a term used by the Platonists to describe the idea of an oligarchical or an Aristotelian conception. Now, the idea of a universal empire, that's what Michael Ledeen, what Richard Pearl, what Paul Wolfowitz have today. The idea that the United States should be the permanent empire with rule over the world. Now, Machiavelli went on and said in a universal empire there's no change, no challenge to authority, and there's a divine creation which was perfect and therefore could not be challenged. Again, that's the Aristotelian idea. But Machiavelli, who knew history, especially, what was the history you would know? You would know Roman history. Did the Roman Empire last forever? Did the Third Reich last forever? Did any empire last forever? No, empires carry within them the seeds of their own collapse. And so Machiavelli said universal empires can and will collapse. Whereas individual communes and principalities must have change, or they may disappear. But change is positive. He said the decline of Rome, and this is in the history of Florence, he said the decline of Rome led to the emergence of new states, new languages, new ideas. Florence itself came into existence after the collapse of the Roman Empire. On the superiority of a republic, Machiavelli had the following to say. Its superiority lays in the fact that in a republic, the common good takes precedence over the good of individuals. The populace of a republic is more prudent, more stable, and of sounder judgment than the prince. Wait a second. Wasn't this the guy who said the prince has to rule, the prince has to have all the power? He was talking about a philosopher king. He was talking about Plato's concept, but Machiavelli said it must be rooted in the institutions of a republic, not a Venetian empire. Now, I want to just take a minute to go through what he had to say on the church, because this should give you a sense of what he was fighting. Machiavelli was called an anti-Christian. He wasn't an anti-Christian. He didn't like the church of his time. You know, Percy Shelley is called anti-Christian. He just didn't like the Church of England of his time. Again, the label is put on. But here's what Machiavelli said. In his History of Florence, he reports how corrupt the popes were. Now, in this, he was following another great humanist from Italy, namely Dante Alighieri, who consigned some of the corrupt popes to the lowest layers of hell, levels of hell, in his Commedia. Now, Machiavelli wrote that popes repeatedly invited barbarians into Italy to serve their purposes, and they used spiritual weapons, that is, the defense of the church, for political ends. He said, and this is from the History of Florence, the many wars that were carried on by barbarians in Italy were for the most part caused by the popes, and the many barbarians that flooded her were usually summoned by them. This sort of thing has lasted even to our times. It has kept and now keeps Italy disunited and weak. It will be evident that the popes, first with censures, and then, which is where they censure someone, that is, they take away the power of a local authority, and then with censures and arms at the same time, mixed with indulgences, excited fear and awe. In other words, the popes, instead of being instruments of God's will on earth, became users of power, of threats, to get what they wanted. Now, he talked about how the popes were responsible for increasing instability in Italy. Thus, the pontiffs, now through love for religion, now through their personal ambition, did not cease to provoke new dissensions in Italy and to stir up new wars. And when they made a prince powerful, they repented of it and sought his ruin. Thus, that country which through their own weakness, in other words, Italy, which through their own weakness they could not hold, the popes could not hold, they did not permit any other to hold. That is, they would destroy rather than allow governments to function. Now, he said, whereas the Pope had, according to custom, been confirmed by the Emperor previously, the Emperor, for his election, now had need of the Pope, and the Empire kept on losing its officials and the Church gaining them. By these means, continually, there was an increase in her authority over temporal princes. Now, Machiavelli was attacking the corruption of the Church. He was a reformer in the tradition of Cusa. And when he wrote about Christian education, he was talking about the education under the control of the scholastics. He said that it's this education which was responsible for the fact that we see in this world fewer republics than there used to be of old, and that consequently, in peoples, we do not find the same love of liberty as there was then. This is the result of the worthlessness of men who have interpreted our religion according to sloth and not according to vigor. In other words, they didn't fight for the ideas of Christ, the message, the mission of Christ, but they plopped themselves down and ruled for whatever wealth they could extract. He said, a proper understanding of Christianity allows us the betterment and defense of our country, and intends that we love and honor her, and prepare ourselves to be such that we can defend her. But the Church, going into local issues, local concerns, in fact, taking over local governments, does more damage to the Church than it does to those it attacks. He said, for example, about Boniface VIII, who had attacked the Colonna, who were one of the families in Florence. He said this, although it somewhat injured them, the Colonnas, injured the Church still more, because that weapon, which through love of the faith he might have used effectively, when through personal ambition it was turned against Christians, began to stop cutting. In other words, the love of this mission of Christ, love of the faith, was replaced by just the personal concerns that destroyed the Church. Now, on reforming the Church, Machiavelli said the reform of the Church should be based on the same principles as reforming political institutions, as a corrupt Church, like a corrupted state, requires rebirth. What kind of rebirth? I say that those changes that take them back toward their beginnings, and therefore those are best organized and have longest life, that through their institutions can often renew themselves. Think about what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that you always have the right to renew yourself whenever there's a new tyranny that comes up. These ideas I'm reading to you were not limited to this European context, but are part of the Republican movement that founded this country. He said, the way to renew them is to carry them back to their beginnings, because all the beginnings of religions and republics and of kingdoms must possess some goodness by means of which they gain their first reputation and their first growth. Now, what I want to do is just finish by discussing how this European-wide battle took off, what actually happened after 1511. The League of Cambrai was defeated. The Venetians became the dominant force. Actually, let me just read you what Pius II, who was Cusa's collaborator, Pope Pius II, had to say about the Venetians. This was in a papal bull he wrote in 1460, in which he was denouncing this idea of the power of the oligarchy, even though he himself did not like real republics. Pope Pius II said, "The Venetians behave with the good faith characteristic of barbarians, or after the manner of traders whose nature it is to weigh everything by utility." But what he said, do fish care about law? Now fish, he's referring back to that ring. Remember that? The Venetians are wedded to the sea. That's why they're the trading country. So here's what he said. As among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence, so among human beings the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. And naturally, for they live on the sea and pass their lives in water. They use ships instead of horses. They are not so much companions of men as of fish and comrades of marine monsters. They please only themselves, and while they talk, they listen to and admire themselves. They are hypocrites. They wish to appear Christians before the world, but in reality they never think of God. And except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred, nothing holy. To a Venetian, that is just, which is for the good of the state. That is pious, which increases the empire. They are allowed to do anything that will bring them to supreme power. All law and right may be violated for the sake of power. Now, this was a pope who understood the problems of the Venetians. Pius II, the same one who worked with Cusa to set up the Council of Florence. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go. I'm going to leave this last part that I was going to cover for Saturday night as the final point here, because what's really crucial is to see what the Venetians did after 1511. Because they did two things, typical Venetian. They saw this reform movement of Erasmus, which was trying to change the church. After Pius II died, the Venetians took over the control of the church. And they used the church. And outside of the brief period of time when the Pope joined the League of Cambrai, after 1511, they were the defenders of the faith. But at the same time, so that a reform would not be successful under the rule or under the impetus of the Platonists, the Venetians launched their own Reformation. And Martin Luther came to prominence as a Venetian operative. Not that Luther knew it. According to Erik Erikson, Luther's biggest problem was that he was totally constipated. And he spent hours trying to move his bowels, praying for release. And it was from this he discovered the doctrine of salvation by grace. Now that's a bit of psychohistory from Professor Erik Erikson. I don't know if it's true. It's a good story. Well, I'll get to this in a moment, because this is the central issue that ties us together with the fundamentalists today. So you had the Reformation launch, and I'll go through how that was done by the Venetians. And then at the same time, they then went to the church and launched the Counter-Reformation, which is also known as the Inquisition. And the battlefront, one of the key battlefronts, was that of England around the role of Henry VIII. Because Henry ultimately, under the influence of what Lynn refers to as his sex counselor, who was a Venetian, Zorzi or Giorgi, he was the advisor to Henry VIII, who ultimately told him to break with Rome. And that ensured that Luther's Mishegas down in southern Germany, where Luther was fighting against the church, Henry VIII's break meant that there was going to be a break with the church, and that paved the way for the Counter-Reformation. Now, let me just tell you the one thing that the Venetians introduced into this, which is the corrupting influence that we see to this day. That's this idea of doctrine of salvation by grace. Now, this question of, are you saved? Are you going to have an afterlife? We get back to this question of mortality. Plato takes this up in the discussion with Socrates as Socrates is about to be put to death in the dialogue called the Phaedo, where Socrates argues that he can be poisoned by his enemies, the Democratic Party of Athens, but that will not destroy him, that his soul has immortality. Now, the proof of that is that we know Socrates today, don't we? Socrates is still affecting and changing the world. In this period of time, Socrates and Plato were the leading figures, even though they had died 2,000 years earlier. They were still changing the world. 400 years later, they're still changing the world through the work of Lyndon LaRouche. Well, the Venetians didn't like that concept. The Venetians said, there's only one way you can achieve being saved, that is, having an afterlife in heaven. And that is the doctrine of salvation by grace. That is, by the grace of God, you are an elect. You are selected. And this is what Lynn refers to very often as the Cathar doctrine, or the Bogomiles, who were among the early, one of the split-offs of Christianity, one of the heresies, the Bogomil heresy. And their view was not the view of Paul in Corinthians, where it's love, or faith, hope, and charity, or agape. That is, your work, what you do, your expression of agape in this world, that you go out and do something for the world. No, Luther, and then Calvin, the Venetian view, which came primarily from this figure, Paolo Sarpi. Whoops. There are actually others I'll mention Saturday night, Contarini and others, a whole school of Aristotelians. But Sarpi, this is the guy who was deployed into England around Shakespeare's time. And his view was that if you're not one of the elect, if you're not chosen by God, you're going to hell. There's nothing you can do about it. You can try and latch yourself onto one of the elect, but it's not going to work. And how do you know if you're elect? Because your life is good. God rewards the elect. Look at Pat Robertson. He's convinced he's going to heaven. His view, particular view of this, is called the prosperity doctrine. I'm rich because God has elected me. Now, you're just a poor person. You can't get to heaven on your own. But if you give me money, I'll put in a good word for you. Now, it also includes this conception, which is also part of the fundamentalists today, that you can cut your own deal with Jesus. You can be bad most of your life, but if you finally say, Jesus, I'm sorry for everything, and I really mean it, I love you, you might get a last-minute salvation. Now, this idea, as opposed to a body of work, a life of work, fighting for institutions of government which give meaning to your life, and through which you give meaning to those who came before you. No, the idea is that you somehow have a special privileged position. Some of them take this from the Old Testament, the idea of the Jews as the chosen people. And it's a complete misreading of the Old Testament. God never said, I'm choosing the Jews to give you some real estate. And if you take care of this real estate, I'll let you blow up Palestinians, and I'll let you expand it, and each piece of real estate is more precious. No, the idea of the chosen people is you're chosen to demonstrate the principles of one God invisible. That you will act for the good without any immediate tangible reason. Not for money, not for power, but because you understand there's got to be some higher authority that created this world and that gave you the power to do good. What do the prophets always talk about in the Old Testament? If you aren't doing good, you're going to hell. They don't say, just have faith. Pray out loud a lot in public so people see you. And maybe God will choose you and you'll have salvation. You know, these people who drive around with signed little bumper stickers, when the rapture comes, this car will be without a driver. unmanned or something like that. It's that kind of arrogance. That's this Venetian religious view. Not that you fight for a state. You fight to develop yourself to do God's work. Now, this battle in England, which I'll go over for the first 10 or 15 minutes, 20 minutes on Saturday, and then we're going to start talking about the play Othello. You'll get a sense that this is what Shakespeare was fighting, this character, this Venetian idea, which said we use the church when we control it, when we can't control it, we fight it. Because they're not interested, as Pius II said, in God, they're interested in the power of their state. This is the view of the utopians today. Now, just to give you two final examples of this. First, we have one of the so-called great battles in history, where the Venetians in 1571 led a mobilization to save Christianity from the Turk. The so-called Battle of Lepanto. Once again, there it is, the Venetian lion, the symbol of Venice. And it's the Venetians who are saving civilization from the Turk. And the Battle of Lepanto was when Venice, with Prince Juan of Austria, led the fight to defeat the Turks in this battle, which, according to the Catholic fascist doctrine of Christendom College, was the proof of the superiority of the Spanish domination, or the Spanish view of Catholicism. And of course, it's not even really Spain, it's Spain under the influence of Venice. And finally, to give you a sense of the setting for Othello, this is maybe hard to see, but this is the Venetians have just won a battle at sea. And here you see people carrying a platform on which the Doge and his wife are sitting and his relatives. And the people are cheering, but what are they cheering? They're throwing coins to the poor. Because the ruling elite in Venice were among the most brutal, the most murderous. That the holy days in Venice were always days where people would go to masked balls. And the day after, you'd find bodies in the lagoons, in the canals. And so you get a sense of this idea that's there in the Bravo and in the Ghost Seer and in Othello. This idea of a people for whom the manipulation for personal or familial power is primary. And it's from this standpoint that you look at the key character in the play Othello, and you find it's not Othello, but it's a character by the name Iago. And Iago represents, and I hope we can demonstrate this as we discuss the play, the Venetian method. So let me stop with that, and I know I threw out a lot of years of history, but I think that this is crucial for people to get a sense of how civilizations develop and what the fights are. And if you think this through and go back over your notes, and then think about what Nick presented earlier, I think you'll get a very good sense that this crowd we're fighting today is the same Venetian crowd transplanted to Harvard, Stanford, and a few places like that. But we know how to defeat them, and it's to use a good, healthy dose of Platonic thinking. So let me open the floor for questions. Yes, Liz. Well, the idea of a republic, or the idea of a nation state, is that you have institutions of government which are dedicated to the common good. And the idea that by improving the conditions of all of your citizens, you actually improve the conditions of the whole nation. Now, it's not just some abstract philosophical concept, but if you have an economy, and this is LaRouche's concept of the common good, an economy which reflects these principles, what it means is that through the development of new technologies, parallel to the development of a higher living standard and educational standard of the population, that you're increasing the power over nature per capita and per square kilometer of the whole society. Which means that, quite simply, in a nation with a lot of poor people, if you're really interested in improving the strength of that nation, you have to have an economic policy and an education policy which simultaneously increases the creative power of that population so that they're able to do more work, more productive work. A population of slave laborers may keep a few people rich, but the society as a whole is weak. So if you're a parasitical elite like the Venetian oligarchy, how do you survive? You have to keep all the rest of the world fighting. You get vassal states that go out and do the battles for you. The reason the Venetians went to England is after, I should have mentioned this, after 1511, they knew that they just lucked out in the fight against the League of Cambrai. They knew that that strategic location in the Adriatic was not a good location to run a world empire. And so they looked around the world and they said, where could we be to best run a world empire? And they chose London, England, the British Isles. Now, the common good, the general welfare, is a simple concept. You have government that's committed to ensuring the best protection of the population. Protection, as Machiavelli said, from special interests. Now, that's the idea of our founding fathers, of Lincoln, of Franklin Roosevelt, of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, what's the idea of someone like George W. Bush, to the extent he has a political idea? If my friends, who are better people than yours because they're part of the elect, see, look at Bush's religious view. He thinks because he overcame cocaine and alcohol problems by humbling himself, falling on his knees before God and begging for forgiveness, that now he's become one of the elect. He's like, I'm one of these guys, I'm on a mission from God to destroy terrorism. And so you get these controllers who are much more clever than him, and they say, we've identified the greatest terrorist threat in the world, it's Saddam Hussein. And Bush, like his father, is saying, well, we got to go after the Hitler. And Robert Scheer wrote a hilarious column today in the LA Times. He said, this Saddam Hussein, he just proved why he's called the new Hitler. Look what he just did. He agreed to his unconditional acceptance of UN resolutions. What a dastardly character. Now, Bush, with the conviction of a born-again Christian, is saying, well, I don't care if he has these, if there's no evidence of the weapons, that means he's more clever than we thought. Therefore, we have to go even more aggressively to get rid of him. And anybody who won't is an enemy of ours. So you have the general welfare on the one hand, which starts by saying, look, suppose Saddam Hussein is the worst guy in the world. You want to have peace in the Middle East? What's the best way to do it? You start with Palestine. You start with an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. Now, people who are stupid about this because they've been manipulated around the idea of the Holocaust and guilt over the Holocaust, and you can't criticize Israel because of the Holocaust and all this crap. Well, let's take a place that doesn't have many Jews. Korea. It's not that that's good or bad not having Jews, they just don't have it. But Korea had a war going on between North and South for 55 years. Now, what just happened in Korea? They're going to rebuild North Korea. They're going to have railroads. They're going to have economic development. The Japanese apologized to the North Koreans. The North Koreans apologized to the Japanese. And today they tore down the barbed wire that's been there since I think 1948, and they drove the first stake in the high-speed rail that's going to connect the southern tip of South Korea with Paris, France, going through North Korea. Woo. And who did it? One of the leaders of one of the axis of evil countries, North Korea. Once again, Bush was outfoxed. These damn axis of evil countries, they're getting pretty smart.
Well, he's used to finding out that other people are cleverer than him.
No, he usually doesn't find it out. You don't think someone's going to tell him that, do you? Condi Rice is going to go in and say, "Oh, Mr. President, we were outsmarted by that tin-horn dictator, Kim Jong-il." No, of course not. Look, here's the funny thing. Last week, Koizumi, who's one of the worst leaders of a nation, the Prime Minister of Japan, do you know what he was doing last week, a week ago today? He was at a Boston Red Sox game with Bush Sr. Now, a year earlier, he was at a Baltimore Orioles game with Bush Jr. So the Bushes think the way you get along with the Japanese is you take them to a ball game, especially if there's a Japanese player on one of the teams. And you say, "Well, your people are getting pretty good for those little dark people you are. Pretty soon you'll be up to our little brown people from the United States, you know, the ones we let in from Latin America because they can feel, you know, the Bush view of the world." Now here's Koizumi, who acts like an idiot on economics. He acts like an idiot on most things. And he acted like a statesman in North Korea. So why can't we do that in the Middle East? Well, Rabin wanted to. Rabin represents the real Jewish tradition. The recognition that it's through treating your fellow human beings with justice that's the basis for peace. And so Rabin said, "Look, I've been killing you Palestinians for 30 years. We still don't have peace. You don't have dignity. We don't have peace. Let's try it differently." That's what Oslo was about. And Rabin was murdered by the people who work with Sharon, the people in the Sharon government. And Sharon is saying, "Yeah, we're going to have peace. We're going to have the peace over your dead bodies." Again, you have the general welfare versus the Venetian concept of an oligarchy. The Israelis, and I don't mean all Israelis, the leadership in Israel today is a bunch of psychopaths who came out of this Jabotinsky wing of the Zionist movement, which wanted an alliance with Adolf Hitler. They appealed to Hitler. They said, "If you drop your anti-Semitism, we'll join you in the war against Britain." And these are the people Bush talks about as the men of peace of Israel. The ones who killed the actual peace-loving Israelis. Rabin, who was part of this tradition, the better tradition, the Moses Mendelssohn tradition of Judaism. So if you look at this thing, you take the best of Judaism, the best of Christianity, the best of Islam, and it's all based on a concept of justice and human dignity. Now, can you have peace among the faiths based on that? Of course you can. Can you have peace among the faiths when you say Islam, radical Islam, is an anti-human tendency, as Bush is saying? Yeah, Nick.
How is the Gulf War? Oh, how is the Gulf War fully the responsibility of Israel?
It wasn't Israel; it's this faction in Israel. Because here's what happened: Bush was putting enormous pressure on Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir was the head of something called the Stern Gang in the 1940s. The Stern Gang was a bunch of terrorists. These are the guys who were killing Brits, they were killing Palestinians, they were killing Jews who didn't agree with the Jabotinskyites. This was the radical terrorist wing of the Jabotinskyites. It was Shamir's close friend who went to negotiate with Hitler to form this alliance. Now, when Shamir was prime minister, here you have the irony. These guys were a tiny, tiny grouping within the Zionist movement. Most Jews hated them. The Jews who liked them in the United States were the gangsters, like Meyer Lansky, like Mickey Cohen, who ran the rackets out here, who raised money from rich Jews to provide arms for Israel, and then he claimed that the ship sank. But most people knew he just kept the money. It's the California Attorney General's report from 1944. It says, we don't think they ever bought the arms. You know, they're not above exploiting anybody. Anyway, this network, the other guy, Begin was the other Jabotinskyite, and he headed up something called the Irgun. Begin his group blew up the King David Hotel, which killed almost 80 people in 1947, or maybe it was 45. Anyway, this was an act of terrorism greater than anything done by Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. So these two terrorists formed a party which in the 60s merged and was called the Likud. This is the Jabotinskyites. And because of the crisis in Israel in the 70s, they came to power. And it was a coordinated operation. This was Kissinger's operation. This is the Brzezinski operation. And what they were saying is that, look, we've got nukes. If you don't do what we want, we can use those nukes. And so there was something developed by the Rand Corporation called the breakaway ally scenario. These are really interesting titles, aren't they? And what the breakaway ally scenario said is, let's suppose we want a war against an Arab government. Well, the American people don't want a war. So how can we get a war started? Well, we get the Israelis to launch the war. And then we have to go in to bail Israel out so Israel doesn't use nuclear weapons. Because this grouping, the Shamir, Begin, Sharon, Netanyahu, they're psychotic. So what happened in 1981, Begin ordered an attack on an Iraqi nuclear power plant called the Osirak reactor. This was a preemptive strike. They just sent in Israeli planes and they bombed it, destroyed it. Why? Because they said, well, if they have a nuclear plant, they might make nuclear bombs. Now, here's the interesting thing. Which country do we know in the Middle East has weapons of mass destruction? Israel. Which country has repeatedly violated UN resolutions? Israel. So why are we going to go to war against Iraq, which just said 2 days ago they're going to comply with UN resolutions? And as far as we know, we don't really know, but it's unlikely they have weapons of mass destruction. So this is the blackmail. And what Shamir said in 1990 is, if you don't do something about Saddam, we will. And so the U.S. suckered Saddam. There was a trap. Actually, it was the British who did it. The U.S. Americans just aren't so good at this kind of thing. The British are great at it. The British got Kuwait to start drilling wells, slant wells, so they were taking Iraqi oil. The Iraqis freaked out. They kept communicating to the United States, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the U.S. kept saying, it's your problem. So Saddam met with the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, and said, what should we do? And Glaspie said, hey, it's your problem. So a week later, Iraq moved into Kuwait, and Bush's first response was, well, too bad. Thatcher flew over to the United States on her broom, shoved it up Bush's rear end, and it was called stiffening his spine, and that started the war against Iraq. Now, in the meantime, Shamir was saying, you do it or we're going to do it. And so the U.S. said, these guys are crazy, we can't let them do it, so we'd better go ahead and go to war. Now, Sharon today is saying the same thing. If you don't do it, we're going to do it, and it's not just Iraq, it's Iran, it's Syria, it's Lebanon. And the drumbeat is also, it's Saudi Arabia. And so that's the way this thing is run. It's the same Venetian method. Where's the evidence? How many Americans do you think Saddam had something to do with September 11th? Probably a lot of them. Then you say, well, there's been no evidence of that. They say, oh yeah. Well, he's still a bad guy. What did he do? He kills his own people. Since when did the United States invade somebody because they killed their own people? And how many times do we fund someone so they will kill their own people? We've done that a lot. So this is where you begin to see the problem. It's the lies, yeah.
So the idea is, we couldn't once Israel starts a war, they would just go insane. Like we couldn't control it at all.
Well, Israel would be likely to use nuclear weapons. So the idea is, if you don't want to use nuclear weapons, then we better preempt Israel. That's the breakaway ally scenario. Is that if Israel is going to break away, then we can use that possible breakaway as an excuse for us to do a preemptive strike. So the idea is instead, see, the other thing is that if Israel attacks an Arab government with heavy weapons, the whole Arab world will go up. There'll be incredible slaughter. It'll be like the Crusade in 1096. So instead, the idea is the United States will use a quick surgical strike. Yeah.
I had a question about that. We've said if we go to war in Iraq, that would lead to the collapse of many of the governments in the Middle East. Why is that?
Well, what's called the Arab street, namely the man in the street in these countries, who doesn't really know what to make of the United States, has been radicalized by the Palestinian situation, because what they see, even people who may have been sympathetic toward Israel, and many of whom were sympathetic to Rabin, what they see now on television is Israeli tanks shooting at children. And so what the sense is that with U.S. support, with U.S. weapons, with U.S. money, Israel is maintaining control over the territories by killing Palestinian Arabs. And so there's a radicalization around that. Now, what would happen if Saudi Arabia, the government of Saudi Arabia, which, let's face it, I mean, they're not the greatest government in the world. They don't do much for their people. You do have a parasitical oligarchical family ruling the place. If Lynn were president, he'd talk to them at some point and say, look, you guys should make some changes here. And he'd show them how it would be in their interest to do it, not just order them. But if the Saudi ruling family said, well, we've got to help the United States kill other Arabs, you'd have the radicalization of the younger people in particular. Like college students in Saudi Arabia have two options. If they're rich, they're going to live in Switzerland, the U.S., or somewhere in Europe. If they're not rich, they're going to spend most of their life hating the ruling family of Saudi Arabia. Now, what happens if you have a war in which more Palestinians are killed? If the Palestinians are driven out of the West Bank? If there's pictures of Baghdad in flames? They're going to go after the ruling families. Same thing could happen to King Abdullah II. His family got put in power in Jordan by the British. So what you'd have is the anger of the Arab world. Now, conversely, why is Lynn getting so much coverage in the Arab press? I mean, Lynn is not saying, let's have a jihad against Israel. Lynn is saying it's in the interest of the Arab world and of the Israelis, the Israeli people, and to the United States and Europe to have a policy of economic development in the Middle East. And so all of a sudden, day after day, there are articles about Lynn. The most recent was today. Did you mention this one, Nick, the Al-Ittihad article?
No.
It's an article today, which is a brilliant article by an Arab that we don't know. And what he said is, yeah, look, everyone's saying it's about oil, and sure, the U.S. would like the Iraqi oil and the Saudi oil and so on. But it's not just about oil. And he writes about how in World War I, the issue was the effort to stop the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad and to stop the Trans-Siberian Railroad that would have hooked up Eurasia with the Middle East into Africa. And then he goes on to say that this policy today, the New Silk Road, is the policy of economist Lyndon LaRouche, and he says it's the only way to stop the economic collapse of the financial system. It's a brilliant article. He's absolutely on target because it's not just oil. So as these questions start being taken up in the Arab world, you're getting more sophisticated thinking. They're engaged in a Platonic dialogue with LaRouche. So what is being said now? They're saying, hey, Saddam, don't be an idiot. Don't act like a defiant kid and give Bush the excuse to go in and blow you up. That's what the Arab League basically said. So what does Saddam say? All right, come on in. Check us out. Bush is having shit fits right now. I want my war. And Karl Rove is saying, Bush, you better get a war or you're not going to win the election, because people might ask, what's happening to my 401k? I mean, Bush might say, Saddam stole your 401k. But you can't get away with that. So Bush is freaked out. The people behind him are saying, doesn't matter what Saddam says, we've got to have a war. There's still terrorists out there. Now, what's the danger? Another September 11th. In Israel, in the United States. What do you think would happen if we had another major terrorist act? You'd have the war launched right away. Yeah.
They would blame it.
Yeah, sure. Did you have a question, Charles?
Are you done with this one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. How does the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher tell the U.S. President George Bush what to do?
Because she's got more balls than he does. She was known as the Iron Lady, and Thatcher was chosen because she was a very effective bully. She had this little lap poodle named John Major who replaced her. The problem, look, George Bush Sr. is not exactly an intelligent man. His great statement in the 88 campaign is he was asked, well, what's your vision for the world? And he said, I'm not too good with the vision thing. Now you see where Bush Jr. gets his eloquence. And so what you've got is you've got these illiterates, and they bring in an obviously bright young woman, Condoleezza Rice. They just didn't tell them that Condoleezza Rice's teacher, her mentor, was Madeleine Albright's father. And you know how she got to be friends with Bush? When Bush Jr. was the hatchet man of Bush Sr.'s 92 campaign. Bush in 88, Bush Sr. had a guy named Lee Atwater, who was one of these Carville-type killers. An excellent strategist to destroy opponents, an attack advisor. And he died of cancer, and before he died, he apologized to everyone for what he had done, because he wanted to cut a deal with Jesus. So they didn't have Atwater for the 92 elections. They asked Bush Jr. to do it. So he was the guy who fired everyone that they didn't like. And so he was sitting there waiting for a meeting with his father, and Condoleezza Rice was there. And Condoleezza Rice, besides being a protege of Madeleine Albright's father, is also a concert pianist. But she's also memorized 35 years of baseball statistics. That was her hobby. And so she was sitting there with Bush Jr., who at the time was the owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. And while they were waiting for meetings with Bush Sr., they'd sit there talking baseball for hours. And so later, when Bush got the nomination, George Shultz, who was then the professor who had power of Condoleezza Rice, brought her down and said to Bush Jr., here's your guru. And he said, okay, in case I need to make a trade for a good shortstop, she'll know who it is.
To get the PGA back to baseball, you can keep Condi.
Yeah, they're saying that after her term in office, she might become the new baseball commissioner. So anyway, look, the problem you've got is these guys don't know what they're doing. And so Bush Jr. right now is being told this is the only way to safeguard the world. And this is what he starts to believe. And you've got Rice, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, they all say that. And he believes it. So this is the problem. Yeah, so.
Harley, I'm really coming from the Aristotelian way of thinking. I know that's what I've been taught for so long, where it's can't know truth. So I'm really trying to get to the Platonic level. And being that we speak about Christianity a lot, and those ideals being implemented in government, and false ideas of Christianity as well, I want to bring up the question of the Bible as a credible source of truth. And I know we talked about Christian principles and justice, but I think a large part of what Jesus did when he was on earth, according to the Bible, was he miracles, miraculous things that sort of defied universal physical principles, so it would seem. So how do we interpret something like that?
You don't interpret it. You see, I think if you look at the Bible, I mean, what Lynn has said repeatedly, and this is actually verified by all the great Jewish scholars, that the Old Testament was rewritten during the Babylon captivity. Whole sections of it were rewritten. About the only part of it that was untouched from the original Mosaic form is the first part of Genesis, which of course is one of the most important parts, which defines the idea of what is man. And we know that as a truth, that man is different from all the animals by what? The creative power that we were given by God. And that man is given dominion over nature and the beasts and the fowl and so on. That's something that we've proven, that be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and replenish it. We've demonstrated that by the advances of human civilization. The rest of it's a bunch of crap. It's rewritten. It was rewritten by people who wanted to enslave the Jews and keep them passive. Now, the story of Exodus is probably also, for the most part, true, at least the story of Moses as a leader. And if you look at Moses, Schiller has a fascinating essay on the mission of Moses. Because what Moses represented was the best Egyptian thinking, which later was picked up by the Platonic Greeks. He was a priest of the temple of Ammon. And Moses' decision to free these slaves, because the original word for Hebrews, Hebreos, meant the workers, the slaves. And he freed them. And then you have this whole beautiful metaphor of the period in the desert, the 40 years in the desert. And this is actually, you think about it, God, 40 years wandering in the desert. Well, it wasn't so bad. God was briefing Moses every day. He was providing food. He was right there. And the whole idea was to take the Jews from being a people of slavery, you think like slaves, and get them to understand this concept of one God. So again, you have a beautiful idea of how you develop a nation. And the idea of Moses coming to the promised land, but I can't go there with you. But that you are now prepared to do it. But look, Moses had to fight like hell with the Jews. He and God were, you are a stiff-necked people. Moses goes up, he's talking with God, they write this great 10 Commandments, Moses comes down, and they're just partying away. Golden calf, orgies, all sorts of things going on. Yeah, Moses is hysterical. And he says, how do we deal with these guys? God says, you are a stiff-necked people. Now, Moses fought with them and prepared them. Because the trauma was, what happens when you leave this self-contained situation in the desert and you go into the land of milk and honey, where there are beautiful pagan cults, where there's not monogamy, where there's not the laws that you've been given? Will the Jews hold to this idea of one God? Now, other than that, most of what's in the Old Testament, you can take or leave. It's not really... The prophecies, well, people look at prophets in two ways. Most of what the prophets said was completely true. People were corrupt, therefore you're going to have chaos brought down upon you. If you violate natural law, you're going to get plagues, famine, war. What did Isaiah, what did Jeremiah, Ezekiel, what did these guys say? Repent or you face chaos. That's true. So again, you look at that. Now, the New Testament's a little different, because it's centered around the mission of Jesus Christ. And if you read, this idea of providing the bread and the fishes and the wine and all of this, the miracles, well, maybe, maybe not. The more important thing is, what was the mission of Jesus? What was his life about? It's about this idea of doing the good. And then you read especially the letters of Paul, the epistles of Paul, Corinthians. And what you see is filling out, putting some flesh on this idea. And Paul was influenced by Plato. The early Christians were heavily influenced by the spread of the Greek ideas. Rabbi Philo of Alexandria had access to Plato in the great libraries in Alexandria, which had the works of Plato. So you had this Platonic current. In that sense, the New Testament in Christianity is heavily influenced by this Platonic current. The idea of the good. The idea, Paul's metaphor, we see now through a glass darkly. That is, you don't really see reality. It's like Plato's metaphor of the cave. And so the question then is, how do you know what to do? You have to have faith in the nature of man, the creative potential of man. The love of your fellow man is what guides you. And how do you live on this earth? It's a life of uncertainty, a life of hardship. You still live with the best, to look for the best in others and bring out the best in yourself. And St. Augustine, who really was the Christian who saved Christianity from the barbarians, namely the Romans and also the Christians. Augustine's his key work is The City of God, where he talks about how do you bring these principles of beauty down to the world. And you do it through each individual, fighting for the good. So, instead you have people who can spout Scripture up and down and inside and out, and then come up with these fanciful descriptions, which are what? Where do they get it from? It's like the secular version of this is Nostradamus. Some crackpot living in the 14th century predicted that Prince Charles was going to dump Diana and marry some woman who he said if he can't marry her, he wants to be her tampon. You read Nostradamus and it doesn't quite say that. You read the Revelation of St. John and he doesn't quite say that Jacques Chirac is going to rally the faithful against the Antichrist. I mean, you look at these things and you realize that, if in fact that were true, then how come it wasn't true 400 years ago when they saw much more terrible times? So what people do when they say they're interpreting the Bible is they're trying to read it to fit their own scared sense that we're really nothing. Something outside of us has to provide our lives meaning. Therefore, the only way we can have salvation is through the grace of some higher power. Now, the Platonic conception, the conception of Schiller, the conception of Machiavelli and others in the Platonic current, of Paul, is that you have to act in imitation of Christ. You have to act in the interests of God. That's your mandate as a human being. Which means you have to discover truth, because you have to know what to do. Now, none of us are going to live long enough to discover all the truths, are we? So none of us will ever be perfect. But by learning from the discoveries of the past, by reliving those discoveries, we can develop ourselves as less imperfect. That's how you imitate Christ. And you take that and you apply those ideas to your temporal society. So that you're living today in a world where you're going to live for a short time. None of us is going to live very long, really, in the scope of history. You blink and you're gone. But you have a little bit of time. Now, what do you do with that time? Do you concern yourself with seeking pleasure? Do you try and run away from the pleasure so you can say, I'm going to be good? Every time I have a sexual fantasy, I'm going to whip myself. If that were the case, teenage boys, if they were being honest, would be perpetually getting whipped. So, some of you guys are close enough to being teenagers that you know what I'm talking about. You get a picture of the Doge of Venice and you're starting to have a fantasy. You know you're in trouble. So the point here is that you don't interpret Scripture. You try and get the kernel of truth from it. And the mission of Jesus is what we have to live up to. Now, does that mean we're going to make loaves of bread and turn water into wine and things of that sort? Well, maybe we will. Modern agriculture does that. Not as quickly as Jesus did. But what do? We have the responsibility to act, to feed the hungry, to clothe and house the poor, to act so that the least among us are given the best opportunity for the future, so they can serve God, so they can serve man. And I think from that standpoint, that's the way you have to look at it. Because the person who tries to find the decoder ring so you can figure out what they really mean, that's the person who's an Aristotelian, who sits around with a stick up their butt and doesn't really care about people dying, and yet they call themselves good Christians or good Jews. Yeah, listen.
I was just wondering how this guy Louis Libby, who was busy defending Mark Rich, the guy's been, being investigated for trading with the enemy, goes about setting up his shadow National Security Council, and what is that? I mean...
Because people don't know it, because the media lies, and the people who control the media are the ones who set these things up. Look, what does it mean to have a shadow government? It means they don't always do these things in the open. And then by the time they come into the open, you don't get the truth about it. How many people have even heard of Louis Libby? How many people know much about Paul Wolfowitz or Richard Pearl? So you take a population that knows a whole lot about Britney Spears. Or who's this guy who's supposed to go on the Russian space flight? Was it NSYNC or Backstreet Boys or one of these guys? I mean, how many Americans know everything there is to know about the Backstreet Boys? Or the words of every Beatles song? I mean, people my generation probably can hear the first two notes of a Beatles song and start singing it. But we don't know who Louis Libby is. We don't know who Wolfowitz is. We don't know the Utopians. We don't know H.G. Wells unless we know the Time Machine, because we just saw the lousy movie they made. Bertrand Russell, the only thing you know about him is he was some kind of brilliant philosopher. Some of you think he's a mathematician, scientist. Lynn says he's the most evil man of the 20th century, and people say, what? He was a peacenik. So people don't know this. They don't know this stuff. So you take an ignorant people and you say to them, the biggest threat to your life is that Saddam Hussein might have sent the West Nile virus over here with specially trained Iraqi suicide birds that allowed themselves to be feasted upon by hungry mosquitoes who risked their life so that these Islamic terrorists could bring down the great Satan. A guy who's relatively bright, Patrick Leahy, the senator from Vermont, was saying this on the talk shows last week. If I had been Sam Donaldson, I would say, Senator Leahy, did you drop acid before you came here? But Sam Donaldson said, well, that's an interesting hypothesis, and I believe I read that from someone in the CDC. Now, in fact, the CDC said it's absolutely wrong. But, people go home and they say, oh, God, honey, get the binoculars. We've got to go out and look at those birds. They might be Iraqi agents, Iraqi terrorist robins in our backyard. Get the BB gun. Get the BB gun. Get the beef jerky. We're going into the basement.
I don't think they would ever do it. They're all radical environmentalists. They care about the birds.
Come on, when the birds come to get you. You like birds, but if you see 500 of them with Saddam Hussein mustaches, with mosquitoes swarming around them, you get out the gun. So, look, we're a crazy nation. Totally insane. And meanwhile, there's a lot we can do about this. Because the fact of the matter is that people who don't know anything are getting pretty scared right now. There was an interesting article, I forget where it was, but it was Thomas Friedman, who's a complete idiot, New York Times columnist. And he said, look, the polls may say the American people want this war, But you go out and talk to them and you find out they don't. The military doesn't want it. The French don't want it. The Germans don't want it. The Russians, the Chinese, the Arab world, the Latin American world. Who wants it? The people who run Bush, the Israelis, and maybe Tony Blair. So you go out and tell people, this is not the war you need. You want a war? Let's have a war to build railroads. Let's have a war on disease. There are people who are going to die of AIDS in this country. Children who are going to die a miserable life of AIDS in Africa because we have bad policies. Saddam Hussein did not spread AIDS into the United States. He didn't bring back malaria in Africa. He's not responsible for the airplane you're flying in that has a wheel that might fall off on landing. Look, U.S. Air, in order to stay in business, their ticket agents agreed to an 8% pay cut for the next 7 years. And their mechanics, a 7% pay cut for the next 6 years, just to keep their business going. You don't think one of them is going to leave a wrench in the jet engine at some point? Man, it's a scary world, yeah.
And that's one of the strongest unions in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the unions are being destroyed. Look at Boeing. The Boeing workers were told, well, if you go on strike, you'll lose your job. And if you accept the contract, you're going to lose your job. So which way do you want to lose your job? I mean, look, there's a vacuum out there. People are hungry for ideas. So I think, Liz, the important thing is, and for all of you, take what you know. You don't have to know everything, but you know a few things. Most of you know that LaRouche has been right on his economic forecast for years. Many of you have figured out that he's right in terms of identifying who these guys are that want the war. If you haven't figured it out, sit down with us, we'll show you. And then you can discover it yourself. Then go out and tell people, look, you want to stop war? You want economic development? Here's a plan. Who else has a plan? Nobody. Who else is naming the names of the people pushing the war? So, that's how you organize. Ed, you had a question?
You said empires carry within them the seeds of their own collapse. Was that a quote from something?
It's a quote from me.
Original Schlanger?
No, it's the seeds of their own collapse. That's a quote from someone. But now, what is it that empires do that cause that? An empire is based on the idea that they're going to be able to continually loot subject populations, including their own population. But they're going to keep their own population happy with a little bit of crumbs from the foreign populations they loot. Now, what happens in their own population when people suddenly say, hey, we're getting fewer crumbs? Or when their own population is having to send their children out to slaughter the opposition in the other countries that are really being looted. So that an empire is an inherently unstable proposition because it's based on people's acquiescing to power. Now, look, this is what Jesus fought. Jesus was fighting the Roman Empire. Not directly. He said, don't be suicidal lunatics and go out and try and take on Rome. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But be a human being. The way you fight an empire is you encourage people to act as human beings and recognize the dignity of other human beings. Now, in a republic, if you have disagreements, you elect people who will fight for your view. Now, we have a republic in principle, but most Americans don't know it. They think we have a democracy. That's what you're taught in school. Where's summer? Isn't that what they tell you? You went into your school and someone said, this is a republic, and people said, huh? Yeah, so a republic, we have a democratic republic, which means you get to vote for your representatives who serve in self-government. But it's not a democracy. A democracy would be chaotic. Besides, the problem with democracy is what if you have completely ignorant people whose votes determine what you're going to do.
You get pushed.
Yeah, you get pushed. You get bushwhacked. Yeah,
So
I'll get you next.
I'm in agreement that our education system is severely lacking, considering how many people have
Severely lacking.
considering how many people actually even have advanced degrees. But what is it that you are proposing to do about that?
We're proposing that we've got to reform the education system, which at this point is basically a money-making racket for a handful of schools and is a means of control. They're teaching everything wrong, or if what you get that's right, you don't know how it's right. You can't prove it yourself. You take, for example, the way calculus is taught or the way science is taught. Instead of going through the original discoveries, you learn the answer and you repeat the answer. It's very difficult to do original research. It's very difficult to actually discover things on your own at a college.
I'm currently in a calculus class, and what I found is that I'm learning that they've given me the answers, but I'm learning with the theorems of why they are from the previous course before. So I'm still picking it up. It's just
you're probably not picking it up. What you ought to do is talk to Professor Shields over there.
Who's Professor Shields?
And what he can show you is how the starting point of the way calculus is taught is a fraud. Because they've thrown out the actual founder, the guy who discovered, who invented calculus.
That's true in a lot of
Gottfried
cases.
Wilhelm Leibniz. Yeah, but here's the point. If you don't know what were the issues that led him to create this new mathematical system, then you really don't know much. And you don't even know if what you know is true. And you have to have a way of knowing that. Because otherwise you become essentially someone who has the same amount of so-called knowledge you can get from the internet. The question of how do you make creative breakthroughs? See, the issue in education has to be that you try to create a system so that every child is capable of making a creative breakthrough. That means making a new discovery. The question of genius. Why don't we have more geniuses? Today, even the definition of what's a genius, they'll tell you a genius is someone who's highly disturbed. That brilliance is associated with psychosis. Well, that's not true. The actual process of developing genius was something that was deliberately set out by the Platonists in the 15th century to solve this problem of how come so many people are dying young? How come so many people live miserable lives? And a group called the Brothers of the Common Life took orphans and got them working through the works of Plato, and that launched something called the Renaissance. Had it not been for that educational movement, we'd probably still be living like they did in 14th century France. So the question of education is if you don't study and learn and come to know how the great discoveries were made, you really don't know much. You can't know whether maybe I'm just being told this because that's what the professor's saying. Or it seems to work. It's good enough for practical purposes. But it's not really true. So the question in education is how can you know whether something you're being taught is true? It's not just research, because how do you know what to research? You have to see.
That's where the breakthrough comes.
Truth comes from the ability to develop a hypothesis, so that you can find something for which there's no linear answer. That you can't just make a deductive or inductive discovery, but you're finding something totally new. Now, it may be something that many, many people have discovered themselves, but it's new to you. Once you make this, take yourself through an education, a series of discoveries, so that you have actually mastered most of the great discoveries of universal physical principles up to your time in history, then your mind has actually gone through a process of coming to know all that's developed human society. And then you're actually in a position where you have independent judgment. Otherwise, you take someone who says they're going to go out and research September 11th. Let's say you were in a political science class and the topic was, go research who did September 11th. 99.9% of the people are going to come to the conclusion Osama bin Laden did it. Even though the FBI says there's not a scrap of evidence to prove it. Well, how do you know? Makes sense, isn't it? I mean, his networks tried to blow it up before. And so you see, this is why real education is based on going outside of everything that's being taught now. It's not that everything that's being taught is wrong. It's just that if you don't know how these ideas were derived, it's like the reason I went through this question of the republic versus the phony republic, is that there are a lot of people who would fall for the idea of a Venetian republic today. What's wrong with Venice? They had a republic, didn't they? Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, I have two questions.
Okay.
One, what do you make of what's going on in Florida with the voting scandal? And two, we really need an electoral college because, those are people whose votes count more than ours.
We need an electoral college precisely because of what's going on in Florida. You can rig elections, as everyone in here knows, from what happened in 2000. But let me tell you a little secret. Virtually every election in the 20th century has had rigging that's gone on. And if you're from a family that grew up in the South and you're African American, you know that you didn't have a voice or a vote. And now, with the retreat and destruction of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act may be written out of the picture soon. So look at this Florida thing. I mean, look, the real fraud in the last election is there were tens of thousands of votes that didn't count. Not just 600 or 1,000, tens of thousands. Probably out here there were tens of thousands of votes. The famous story is in 1960. In one of the Democratic Party primaries, Joe Kennedy was calling up one of his operatives. I think this was in the Illinois primary. And he said, how much money do you need to win this primary for Jack? And the guy said, $5 million. He said, $5 million? I don't want to buy a goddamn landslide. I just want him to win by one vote. Elections have been rigged for the longest time. Florida, they're just finding new ways of doing it in public. I mean, it's typical in Florida. There's so much incest in the Republican Party that you have these people who are just doing terrible jobs covering up their fraud. Now, the solution to this has nothing to do with the way you count the votes. We've got to inspire the population to want to fight to improve the country. See, if you have a population that says, I'm going to vote and my vote's going to count, and I'm not going to let some bureaucrat screw up a voting machine so my vote doesn't count. And not only that, but I'll tell you what I want. I want a candidate who's going to fight for my interests. Now, if you have a population like that, you can't rig an election. Because if you try it, they're going to hang you. So, what we need is, in the best periods of our country, we had 80% voter turnout. Because people wanted to participate. Now we're lucky if we get 50% for a presidential race, and you can get 10 to 12% in a primary. So the key is this mobilizing the population to act in their own interests. Now, in the Electoral College, the reason that was done is because the Founding Fathers knew that you can rig a vote. And so you put a period of time between the time of the vote and when the ballots are cast by the Electoral College. You say, what should have happened between November 7th and the inauguration? The people who were the Electoral College should have had the opportunity to figure out what happened to the Florida vote. And if there's fraud, then you don't care what technically a judge decides or even what the Supreme Court decides. You vote your conscience. Now, the Electoral College system doesn't work too well either because of the corruption of the whole system. So the solution is we have to make people less corrupt. And you know the best way to address corruption? You start with yourself. You make sure that you're not manipulated by appeals, whether it's an appeal based on race, on religion, based on ethnicity, based on living standard, but that you act for the truth and for the good. And then you go out and recruit other people to do that. And if you do that, we'll solve our electoral problem because we'll get better candidates. See, if we had two good candidates running for president, it wouldn't matter that much which one won, would it? If you have two complete lunatics and imbeciles, then it doesn't, you vote for one, you might as well have the other. Exactly. Yeah, look at this. Davis is such a disappointment because the guy knows that everything he's saying is a lie. Here's a guy whose state's been destroyed by deregulation, and he says he's for more deregulation. He's running against a guy who's dumb. Bill Simon Jr. is dumb. He's corrupt. Everything he says is from a printout from the American Enterprise Institute. His family's a bunch of crooks. His father could have been a doge in Venice. And Gray Davis is barely ahead of him in the polls. It's an outrage. And we're trying to do something with the Democratic Party here.
It's like it feels like no one's really voting, It's like two people are voting. Maybe.
Well, you're not so far from the truth there.
They're voting for themselves.
Yeah. So we need the kind of movement that was launched by the Platonists in the end of the 15th century. A reform movement that's in education, that's in economics, that's reforming the religious institutions. Look, one of the biggest forms of corruption in this country is organized religion. Preachers and ministers are corrupt. They couldn't possibly believe half the stuff they say. You have the phenomenon in the African American community, Reverend Chicken Wing. You build a new wing to my church and give me enough money to get a Cadillac, I'll back you. I'm with you. Look what's happening now. The churches don't have money because the congregants are poor. You look at what's happening not just in African American churches. Go to rural America, white ministers, congregations. People have less money, so the churches are getting poorer. So what do they come up with? Faith-based initiative. The government will give you money. And so now you have all these black preachers who are backing Republicans. It's all money. You look in the Jewish community, you get rabbis who know Sharon is a Nazi. And they'll defend him because they're afraid if you don't defend him, you'll look anti-Semitic. Defending Sharon is proof that you hate Jews. Because he's going to destroy Israel much better than Arafat ever could. If Arafat wanted to destroy Israel, he couldn't do the damage to Israel that Sharon is doing. So if you love Jewish people and you love the state of Israel, you've got to get rid of Sharon. You got to investigate who killed Rabin. You got to get someone in there who's got guts who will fight for a Palestinian state. Because that's the only way Israel's ever going to have security. You don't do that, don't tell me you're a rabbi. Because you're just lying to the people who are your congregation. So I'll take one more question, then we can move into something else. Anyone else have a question?
I just wanted.
Go ahead.
Somebody else have a question?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to ask a question about this guy Sarpi.
Yeah.
And the old famous Occam's razor. So what? Can you just go over briefly his basic points of his philosophy?
Let me do that next time.
Okay.
That's what I want to do.
Because I know he has some students after him. Who were specifically his students?
Well, Sarpi actually was very much involved in launching what became the pseudo-Platonist movement, which was a mystical movement that created Robert Flood. This is the group out of which Bacon came, the Rosicrucian, the mystics. So it was a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-Platonic movement designed to manipulate England away from the Thomas More tradition and into accepting the idea of being an imperial state. But I'll go through that next time. I just don't have the time. Go ahead, Scott. What's your question?
You linked Aristotle with the scholastics. We'll talk about that. And in the Electable LaRouche one says that the idea of simultaneity of eternity with the scholastics.
Well, the scholastics were specifically the professors who taught Aristotle, and who argued that the way that they later took the name the encyclopedists. In the Voltaire, the so-called Enlightenment, was a scholastic movement. And essentially what they said is that you have to be objective. You can't let the individual human being and the apparatus of the individual human being involved in your investigation. You have to find objective causes of things. That is, that things just happen. And the argument that you can find causality, Aristotle's basic view is you can't know causality. You know the effects of something by observation, but you can't know what causes it. And so the scholastic argument was that human knowledge is identifying everything and coming up with formulas that show the interactions between things. But that the idea, including with human beings, the idea that there's a principle that drives man. Essentially, if you see man as a kind of computer, then you can't even know what drives individual man. You have to assume it's individual self-interest. And so from this you get the argument that is often used, that somebody who's fighting for the good is really just doing that because they're lacking something in themselves, and so they do that to be recognized. So you get these crazy kinds of formulations that you find in modern psychology and so on. But the essential principle of the scholastics was the Aristotelian nominalism. You can't know the truth. You can't know the ultimate cause. You can't know what causes the directionality or the change in the universe. You can't really know why a planet slows down and speeds up. In fact, if it were up to the Aristotelians, we never would have discovered that. So the question of scholasticism, this was just it was centered literally at the University of Paris in the 14th and 15th century. Mark, I think, talked about this the other night, the Abelard movement, the great movement to build the cathedrals. They were enemies of the scholastics. So what you should do your own investigation of this. Take the Cusa book, because Cusa was an enemy of this crowd also. They slandered him for years. They said Cusa's science is mystical. This is what they say about Kepler. Kepler was a mystic. The fact that he came pretty close to certain descriptions, well, that was just luck.
So was that a joke by LaRouche in the Electrical Rouge?
What does he say?
He doesn't say from the scholastics. He said what scholastics term, quote unquote, simultaneous.
Okay, that's So
he was talking about legal.
He's basically taking the yeah.
Yeah, it was just reference, I guess, probably.
Maybe that's just the way. There's probably something that pissed him off about something he read somewhere, so he just said it that way. But the concept of the simultaneity of eternity is something that the scholastic can't really understand, so there's an irony there. Yeah, because to understand the simultaneity of eternity, you have to understand that human beings actually have a soul. And the scholastics would argue that there's no evidence of that. You can't prove it. You live and you die, that's it. So get all the gusto while you're still here. Go for all the gusto. You can have it all. Yeah.
That reminds me of there's somewhere in the Bible where it's something like to, pretty much like do everything that you want to do and travel everywhere.
I think that's the Army slogan. Be all that you can be.
But there's somewhere in the Bible where it says something like that. Something to that.
I don't know, there's a lot in the Bible.
Where it says like leave your family and go forth and make your own house and all this stuff.
No, it's just like do everything you can while you have the time. Go and do pretty much anything you want.
Yeah, I think that's the existentialist handbook. I don't think that's the Bible. I mean, the idea of freedom and necessity is an important paradox in life. We have free will. God gives us free will. Does that mean we should just do whatever we feel like? Well, that's what my generation argued. Yeah, whatever feels good, do it. Don't worry about the consequences. There are no consequences.
My best friend used to
God is dead. You live, you die. You might as well have some fun while you're here. And if you can't have any fun, what's the point in being here? This is where nihilism comes from, existentialism. And so, the real argument of the duality of the free will versus necessity paradox is that what Schiller talks about in the Sublime. You make yourself an instrument of the good. You develop your emotions so you do the good instinctively, intuitively, and that's what gives you pleasure. Your pleasure comes from acting across history for all of mankind. And that way your life has meaning. Whereas if you think, let's see, I'm going to have meaning because between 18 and 24 I'm going to screw every woman I can find. And then when I get a little older I'll cut down on that a little bit, but I'll visit every country I can go to. And then I'll become an advisor to Bush and bomb every country I want to. And then I can look back over my life and say, this was one big screw job. No, the thing you got to do, the Platonic conception, the Schillerian conception, is you do the good willingly, and that's what gives you pleasure. And that's how you can go out of this world, as Lynn says, with a smile on your lips. You look back over your life and you say, my name may not be in a history book, but the people who come after me will have better lives because of what I did, and therefore I did something good for the people who came before me. As Sam was saying on Saturday, if you grew up from a family of slaves, you can give their suffering meaning by your actions in this world to ensure that you fight against all forms of slavery, including being a slave to the bank by paying off a credit card all the time or debt. So, in that sense, that's what it means to live in the simultaneity of eternity. That your life here in this temporal moment now has meaning for all history, as opposed to a meaning that's only contained in what does my sensory apparatus grasp at this moment. So I don't think the do your own thing comes from the Bible.
I'll find where it's at.
All right. Could have been what Satan was saying. Jesus, I'll make you a deal. You can do your own thing in your own time. And then Jesus wisely said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." All right, so look, we've got a lot of organizing to do, and I think some of you have been doing some organizing. Some of you haven't. We should have a sign-up sheet out there, shouldn't we? Liz, is there someone there who can...
Yeah, sign-up sheet on the board, and we also have about 1,000 leaflets, the new ones.
Okay. And join us, Thursday and Friday. We're going to do deployments, and we'll have another class on Saturday where we may have an initial class on the Punic Wars, which were the wars of which established the Roman Empire. And then I'll do the second part on this question of Sarpi in England, and then we may get into Othello, and if we do, we'll have Robert up here with me to discuss it. And you get it. But what I would recommend, in addition to organizing, is pick up the Shakespeare play Othello and start reading it. Because we're not going to come in here and give it to you. You've got to experience it. You've got to learn it. You've got to study it. You have to come to know the mind of Shakespeare. And that will help you in your ability to communicate. Just as those people who are working on William Tell, who are taking it seriously, actually are becoming more able to convey ideas. I mean, if you really work seriously on a classical drama, it improves your ability to communicate profound and impassioned ideas. Okay? So, sign up for organizing and see you soon.